Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. The word of the Lord.
Hey, like I mentioned, it is great that you've joined us today. Last week, actually, Pastor Walt, our location pastor here in Midtown, actually kicked us off in this new message series. And the message series is called Clash. And over this week as well as next week, we're going to be talking about themes related to how do we navigate conflict in the world around us. Now, what's great about this topic is that whether you're a Christian or you're not, you may not be religious. Maybe someone dragged you here, maybe a parent or maybe a child. Someone dragged you here and you're like, I'm not really into this Christian thing. Well, today's topic, this idea of conflict, and the reality is that we all get into conflicts and we clash in different moments in our lives, whether it's with our coworkers, whether it's people from a different political persuasion, whether it's people from Staten Island, right? Wherever people are from, wherever human beings are, we all clash at different moments in our lives. And so the hope is that whatever your background might be, whether you're religious or irreligious, hopefully the themes that will be brought up today, hopefully there's a certain wisdom to it that you'll be like, you know what, that actually makes a lot of sense. Because we're actually gonna be looking at the words of Jesus and what Jesus has to say about this topic of clashing, or the way that we go about going into conflict with one another. And so this idea of, hey, let's get ready to learn how do we navigate conflict and clash. So go ahead and high five your neighbor and say, let's clash. Do that real quick. Yeah, right. Now I recognize for some of us it hits a little close to home. It always tends to be this way, right? I'm on my way to church and just that's the time when we happen to get into arguments or whatever else it might be. And yet, again, this is an invitation of everyday life. We get into these different moments. Now, some of the words of Jesus might be really surprising to us because in the Sermon on the Mount, which is the passage that was just read for us from Chacho, it's known as this greater body of wisdom literature. Again, you don't even have to be a Christian to appreciate some of the wisdom that Jesus talks about, the way that we navigate life and follow this narrow path of following Jesus. Now, what's so interesting about what Jesus says is it goes against many of the ways or the caricatures that people might have about Christians. So for instance, look at what it says in Matthew chapter 7 as it begins. He says, do not judge. High five your neighbor. Say, do not judge. That's right. Or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, isn't this interesting? Because so many research studies have been done about how Christians in broader culture today are known to be incredibly judgmental. And yet here from the words of Jesus, he's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount about, he's saying, do not judge or you too will be judged. And he talks about how each of us have a measurement or a standard by which we live. And here he is, he's using this word of what Christians are most well known for, of being a judgmental community. Now this word krino that's used, it's a word that has a negative connotation to it when he says do not judge or you too will be judged. It has this idea of separating, again, in this very negative kind of way. And so when Jesus is saying this, now some of us might be like, well, actually, I need to be judgmental to live in the city. Because honestly, I have to be able to navigate how I go about my workplace, who I'm gonna hang out with. Even walking down the street, judgments are being made every day. Am I gonna walk close to that person? Am I gonna walk away? Or like which subway car to get on? I mean, how in the world are we supposed to live this out when it comes to judging? Well, most of us, whenever we think about this idea of judging, we can sometimes confuse the idea of judging with discerning. What's interesting is that Jesus would actually teach in other parables as well as in teachings when he talks about the way that we're to interact with others. Check out what he says in Matthew chapter 10 when he's speaking to his disciples about being sent out into the world. Notice what he says. He says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Now this is when he's saying, disciples, I'm sending you out as my kind of representatives into the world. But I do this, but be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. In other words, Jesus is talking about a posture in which we're supposed to approach the world and engage with the world. It's with a certain amount of shrewdness or wisdom. And so here he is, Jesus is in the same book of Matthew. He's talking about this idea of approaching the world with shrewdness, with wisdom and prudence, and being innocent as doves. So in other words, Jesus is not saying like, hey, when I say do not judge, he's not saying suspend all rational thinking when it comes to approaching others. He's talking about a particular way of relating, especially in conflict. And so there's a nuance here between judging and discerning. Jesus is for both not being judgmental as well as being discerning, being prudent in the ways that we go about our lives. Now, notice what is the distinction then? What is this negative kind of judging that Jesus is trying to get at? Look at what it says. He says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye? Now, you got to understand, like he's emphasizing, and hyperbole is being used here. He's talking about a speck, like the small little speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye. That word for plank is a word for a long log, like this. So could you imagine what Jesus is saying? He's saying, this little speck in your brother's eye, this is what you're pointing out, and you've got this massive log in your own eye. How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Now look at what he says. He says, you hypocrite. This word for hypocrite in the Greek is this word for someone who wears a mask in a theater. He says, you hypocrite. First take the plank or this log, this long log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now notice, Jesus is saying, you will be able to remove the speck in your brother's eye, but do you see first, the initial posture is you need to be able to confront yourself first. Notice the word that Jesus uses. He calls the person who's judgmental and pointing out someone else's flaws, especially the small little speck in their eye. He calls them hypocrites. Now, a few years ago, a book was released. It was research that was done by David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons, and the book was called Unchristian. And in this book, they took surveys of various people who did not go to church, but how they perceived Christians and the church. Now, what was interesting is that when it came down to the top two characteristics of how other people outside the church view the church, the first word that was used to describe how people outside the church view Christians was, number one, was judgmental. And number two was hypocritical. Now, some of you are like, hey, I can understand that. That's in fact why I don't want to go to church. So I understand where the research comes from. But that's what's so surprising of Jesus' words. He's decrying the very thing that so many of us, especially in popular culture, can be guilty of being judgmental and hypocritical. And the invitation that Jesus does and the challenge and the exhortation that he says about following him is that if anything that the church should be known for, it should be as a people who are not judgmental. In fact, that's why he says so clearly, do not judge. That's why he says, you hypocrites. He's decrying those kinds of behaviors. And he's inviting us to something different. But again, this passage, it's not like it's saying, hey, remove all kinds of discernment or judging. He talks about a particular posture when it comes to conflict. He's basically saying in conflict, when it comes down to it. Because remember, later in the passage, he's saying, before you remove that speck. So the expectation is, of course, we're going to help each other. But before you do that, in conflict, confront yourself first. Before you think about the other person and how they've messed up and all the ways in which they're not measuring up, take the time to confront yourself first. Now, this whole posture, it's so different than the ways of the world. Because again, in a city like ours, we are taught to blame other people, to sue them, take them to court, to think about all the ways that they failed us. Now, this is not to say that evil doesn't exist in the world and people don't perpetrate violence or evil against us. What Jesus is simply saying is, take a look at yourself first. Confront yourself before anyone else. Now, this posture is so different than the ways of the world around us, and yet it's common throughout the scriptures. Check out what the psalmist writes in Psalm 139. Look at this passage. It's a beautiful passage, and it's an invitation for God, the God who knows all things. Look at what it says in Psalm 139. He says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, isn't this interesting? Here the psalmist is basically saying, God, I want you to search me. But here, earlier in the passage, it actually, in this psalm, it says, God, you have searched me and you know me. In other words, this psalm already says, God, you are omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. You know all things. And yet at the very end of this psalm, it's an invitation of this posture that even though you know all things, God, I want you to actually search me and know me, test my anxious thoughts. And if there's any offensive way in me, lead me in the way of everlasting. Now, why would the psalmist pray this prayer if God already knows all things? It's because it demonstrates the kind of posture that what it means to actually follow this God. It means that we have a posture of humility that's willing to look and invite God to search through the caverns of our own soul, of all the ways in which we might be offensive, even the ways that I might not be aware of it, to actually confront myself before anyone or anything else. In 1955, Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingham actually developed this framework, and this framework is actually called the Johari window. Now, Johari simply comes from their first names, Joseph and Harrington put together. Now, in the Johari window, there's this framework, and it's used in group therapy sessions often, even today. And it's a way of again, doing inventory of ourselves when it comes to growing in our own self-awareness. Now, if you notice kind of in this framework, along the top, you can see there's the x-axis. It's what's known to me as well as unknown to me. And then on the y-axis, it's known to others and unknown to others. Now, if you see in the top left quadrant, this is the open area of our lives. That's what's known to me as well as known to others. This is what you see, and we all know this about each other. But notice as you move to the quadrant in the top right, that's the part that's known to others but not known to me. We call these blind spots. Now, this thing about blind spots is we all have blind spots. Even though so many of us think that we're experts in our own self-awareness. My son David, he actually just got back from camp, and I was showing him some pictures I was showing him pictures. I'm like, hey, look at these pictures of me and, where I was, and because I visited your cousins, and I was showing him, and he was like, oh my goodness, I love that picture right there. I'm going to send that to Amma. And I was like, oh, okay. But it was just a picture with me and a friend. And I was like, oh, so like, why are you sending it to her? It's like, you look so bald in that picture. And I was like, oh, it's like, I was like, I'm not bald. He's like, no, I gotta send it. I'm telling you, you look so bald. And I was like, oh, I'm not that bald. And and then there was a little bit of concern. He was kind of concerned for me. And then I'm like, David, I still have hair. He goes, dude. He's like, Appa, look at the picture. Like, look at, and like it dawned on me. And then so like I went into the bathroom. And I kind of looked down like this, and I was looking at the top of my, because I realized I don't look at the top of my head. I'm just looking at the top of my head. Kind of thin up there. So he sends it to my wife. But it was, and it was like this revelation. I'm like, oh, I guess I am balding. But I realized I don't look at the top of my head often. Even when I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I'm like, oh, look, there's hair here. And, I'm just. But we all have these blind spots. Now, part of what growth looks like in this Johari window, for instance, is that my blind spots, what I do is I ask for feedback to widen this open area. Now, in the same way, the Proverbs and the scriptures are replete with, when we go about in our communities, we're doing it, we're seeking counsel from others. That's this idea of, again, asking for feedback. But also there's this part of us to open out this, to broaden this open space for us is actually to move into this area of the hiddenness, the only things that are known to me but not known to others. Those are the areas of shame, or maybe they're addictions. Those are the things that, especially in today's kind of social media cultivated world, it's so easy to hide some of the things that we struggle with or the pain points. And what the invitation of the Johari window is that we are to be a people who we actually disclose to others. We let people in to these areas of our lives that are hidden. Again, there are other parts of the scriptures. For instance, James talks about confessing your sins to one another so that you may be healed. In other words, there's this invitation then that as we go about in the world around us, hopefully we are people who are consistently saying, God, search me and know me. And we're growing in our own self-awareness so that we might be shaped into the image of what God has called all of us to be. An invitation for us to confront ourselves. And what Jesus is saying, hey, before you go about, especially in conflict, of blaming other people, of seeing that speck in their eye, will you and will I do the work of saying, God, would you search me? All those ways, hidden or unhidden. Help me to see the logs in my own eye. One of the conflicts in my life that has probably been the preeminent conflict as I look back at the history of my life, and it will likely be no surprise to you because I've mentioned my relationship with my father. Growing up with 3 brothers to an immigrant parents, and my dad and I, we just had such an acrimonious relationship throughout our childhood, not only with me, but also with my brothers throughout our lives. And my father worked a lot, was very violent, temperamental, experienced a lot of pain as a result of that, pain at the way that he treated my mom and all of us. And so I remember though, in my 20s, my early 20s was when the first time I started to see a professional therapist. And so as I was seeing a professional therapist for the first time, and I was tapping into feelings and emotions and experiences that I had never thought about before because I was simply just kind of living my life, the inertia of my own kind of youthful primal energy that was taking me throughout life. But I realized that there were these hiccups that were appearing in my own heart and the ways that I was behaving. And so I was becoming awakened to all of these moments of anger and frustration with my dad. And it almost felt like it was the first time I had permission to be angry and to communicate my own anger. So as I'm in this process, it felt like I was becoming alive to things that I hadn't been alive to before. I could feel the fury of all the rage of pain and woundedness that I had experienced, even that my dad wasn't aware of. And so in this whole process, I remember early on after those first few counseling sessions, I remember thinking to myself, you know what? Someone's got to stop my dad. Like I've got to say something to him, be as truthful as I can, because if someone doesn't stop him, he's going to perpetuate the same kinds of things to my brothers and et cetera, et cetera. So I remember just having this resolve, like it is my role to fix my dad. So I remember the first time I said to him, Dad, and I'm in my 20s, I'm like, Dad, hey, I need to talk to you about something, which was strange because we often didn't sit and talk about things. And so I remember going out to Los Angeles, sitting down with him at this one restaurant for breakfast. And I started sharing with him. I said, Dad, I've been so angry at you, so hurt by the ways that you treated Mom, the ways you treated me, the way you treated, my brothers. And I've just been so angry, and you cannot behave that way anymore. And my dad was listening to me. He's like, oh, okay. And then he says to me, you know why I was so angry? It's because you were such a bad son. I know. And then I was like, you're right, Dad. That's not what I said. I was like, I was a bad son. And then all of a sudden, I'm angry, frustrated, triggered. We're going back and forth. That conversation did not end very well. And shortly after that, my dad, he ended up telling me, he says, you are not my son. Don't ever talk to me or reach out to me again. And I was so stunned by everything that had happened. And of course, I was still even more infuriated. Now, what would happen then over the next few years in my 20s and even into my early 30s was this back and forth with my dad about my dad, someone needs to chain this guy. Someone needs to fix him and transform him. Meanwhile, I'm on this whole emotional health journey. And on this whole emotional health journey, I'm wrestling with my own pain of my past. And one of the things that was part of my emotional health journey that was so healing for me was just my own kind of visits to 12-step groups in Alcoholics Anonymous and seeing kind of just the recovery process that a lot of people who struggle with addiction go through. And after every 12-step meeting, there's an invitation to actually read and recite this prayer together. It's called the Serenity Prayer. Here's what the Serenity Prayer says. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And every week, we would recite this prayer, we'd say this prayer, and this prayer became so instructive to me and so helpful for the ways that I would approach life and bouts of depression and difficulty and anxiety. Like, this prayer became such an anchor for me. And it finally dawned on me, like, as I would recite this prayer, look at this prayer would be posted across in front of me in my desk. My relationship with my dad, I was so fixated on wanting to change my dad. And I realized that my motivation was like, my motivation was love though. My motivation is I lovingly want to fix him and to change him. He wasn't gonna change. There's no way that I could have changed him. And there came this moment when I realized, like, maybe it's me. I'm the problem. To quote Taylor Swift, it's me. Maybe I need the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, but I need the courage to change the things I can. Today, my relationship with my dad is the best it's ever been. Now, are there moments when I still get triggered? Absolutely. But just last summer, I actually spent 4 hours in uninterrupted conversation with him. I know, and my wife, I remember basically 2 hours in, my wife, my phone was blown up. Tina's texting me, is everything okay? What's going on? You still alive? What's going on, And I realized, my relationship with my dad has changed to the point where, because it was no longer about wanting to fix my dad, it was instead learning to curiously hear about his own life and experiences. And the reason why we were able to talk so long is I was just asking him questions about his own childhood, his own pain that he experienced, his own humanity, the ways in which he grew up without a father in war-torn Korea, the ways, the oppressive kind of racism he experienced when he immigrated to the country, the ways in which he had no idea how to raise kids and how to make it because he was working so much and he never had a father of his own. And I realized the place where my relationship with my dad is now, what's been so instructive was so much of my efforts was to lovingly change my dad. And the key to change was not trying to lovingly change him, but was actually just confronting myself and asking God to do a work of healing inside of me. Now, this does not mean that I have not been in a process of trying to heal from my own wounds or not processing in prayerful ways to actually birth a certain kind of measure of forgiveness in my own heart. But instead, it was an invitation for me. What does it look like for me to control the things that I can? Now, I should add here, some of us are in relationships that have been very toxic or abusive. And so I realize that power dynamics, for instance, for some of you, you need to cut off a relationship for particular reasons because of the wounds and the trauma that are too extreme right now. So I realize that my experience is just instructive. It's been instructive for me about just me confronting what are the things that I can change. So I recognize that some of us are in different seasons. But do you see, this posture remains the same? It's the posture of what do I need to own when it comes to any kind of conflict or beef or clash that I might find myself in? What does it look like for me to do the work before God, before anything else, before pointing the finger at anyone else or pointing out the speck in their own eye? What does it look like for me to say, God, would you search me? If there's any offensive way in me, if there's any self-righteous bone in my body, if there's anything that leads me to say hurtful and damning words to people when that is not what I hope or mean to say, God, would you search me? Now, this posture is so different than the way of the city, than the way of the world around us. So how do I do this then, right? Because when it comes to judging, if there's this idea of judging, Notice that what it says is do not judge. Why? Because the measure that you judge yourself, he says every single one of us has a standard, and the reality is we all fail our own standard. Now, you know what's interesting, though, is Jesus is teaching this. He says, don't judge, because everyone breaks their own standard. But the one person who actually has a right to judge then, who has a standard that he or she never breaks, the one person is Jesus, is God. Now, notice, look at what it says. He says, do not judge or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. But here's what's interesting. Jesus says this, knowing full well that throughout the scriptures, that the way that God is described, one of his many attributes, is that his attribute is that he is completely and absolutely just. Look what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4. He is the rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong. Upright and just is he. Now, even if you're not a Christian, if there was a God, you would probably say, I think that if there was a God, that God would be just. Well, that confirms what the scriptures teach about who God is, that God is completely and absolutely just. So here Jesus is talking about do not judge, because the reason why is because you yourself break even the standards that you have about yourself. And yet here Jesus is, the one who's God in the flesh, who has every right to judge, to condemn, to call out your sin and mine. And yet here's what Christians believe. That Jesus, who has the very right to judge, condemn, to divide, is a God that instead of judging you and condemning you, he would rather die for you. He would rather give his life for you. He would rather die on a cross in our stead to show me and you that yes, he's the only one, the rightful judge, the only just one who was sinless. And yet he would die on a cross to bear our shame and to communicate to the world that he would rather die for you than condemn you. This is the God that we serve. See, the earliest Christians understood this. Look at what Paul says in Romans chapter 3. It says, it was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying, yes, God is just. Jesus is just and lives a sinless life. But not only is Jesus just, he is also the justifier. He's the one that in your stead would go before God and die on a cross to say to a loving father, God, would you welcome these sons and daughters? Would you see the death that I die on their behalf so that they can become welcome in the family? And would you justify them? And this is what Jesus does. He dies on the cross for us out of love for us. So why in the world would anyone want to have this posture where they're willing to do this self-confrontation? Because again, in the world around us, it's not about self-confrontation, it's about confronting other people, especially in this city. But why would anyone do that? See, the only people who could actually look within and be able to say, God, would you search me and know me? It's only people who are so secure in themselves, who have found that they are so willing to accept their lovability as well as willing to want to grow and open to growing and changing to become the best version of ourselves. The only person who's able to do that is someone who's so secure, who has this view of humility and hunger. And it only comes from believing in a God who would be just and justifier. And see, the only way that we could come and say, God, would you search me and know me, is when each of us have said, God, yeah, I want to be the kind of person so secure in your love, but also so secure in your love that I would want to grow and change. And so the invitation for every single one of us today is, what are the areas of the caverns of your heart and soul that today we just want to come before God and say, God, yeah, the ways that my anger has gotten the best of me. I've got this habit when it comes to alcohol that I just can't kick. It leads me to do things that I regret. There's ways in which in my relationship I realize my woundedness. I end up saying things to people that I love that I regret. Or as a parent, there are things that I've said to my children that, God, just would you search me? Or there are things that I've said to my parents, God, would you search me? Or maybe today where it's just, God, I just realized that I want to have the kind of posture where you would search me and know me. Help me to confront myself before anyone else. That I would be someone who's willing to confess before you. Psalm 139, it says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting.